a humble young woman married an Arab billionaire she had just met. The next day, he died under mysterious circumstances. What she discovered about him afterward. Lucy Morales lived in a small apartment in the southern part of the city where the narrow streets barely let sunlight through. Her life revolved around a single priority, her mother's well-being. Mrs. Elizabeth was elderly and in fragile health, unable to care for herself because a chronic illness kept her bedridden. The atmosphere at home felt gloomy, with windows covered by worn-out curtains and old furniture testifying to the family's financial hardship. Lucy woke up every morning before dawn to make sure her mother had her medications within reach and something warm for breakfast. The routine exhausted her, but deep filial love kept her going. In her mind, she was determined to earn enough money to pay for the treatments that would keep her mother alive and dignified. Over the years, financial troubles had piled up. It wasn't just about covering Mrs. Elizabeth's medical expenses. The rent for their tiny apartment was always on the verge of expiring, and the electricity and water bills arrived relentlessly at the end of each month. Lucy worked double shifts in a modest neighborhood restaurant, a place whose tables and facilities were far from luxurious, but she regarded it as stable employment. Every morning at sunrise, she rushed to open the restaurant with the manager and stayed until late afternoon, serving simple dishes to customers who left only a few coins as tips. It was never enough to cover medical bills, and each time Lucy received her weekly wages, she noticed with despair how the money was gone in an instant. Still, she refused to give up, keeping her faith that somehow she would find a radical solution to ease the situation. For a couple of weeks, Lucy had tried to find a second nighttime job, but her only opportunity came from a bakery that opened before dawn. She was already overwhelmed by physical exhaustion, and Mrs. Elizabeth feared her daughter would collapse under such strain. Even so, Lucy showed up each night to knead dough and prepare rolls, hoping to earn a little extra. However, the pay turned out to be much lower than expected, and the workload was unsustainable. After a few difficult days, she realized that continuing that frenetic pace would jeopardize both her health and her mother's. She needed a more practical, less grueling alternative. That was when someone from the neighborhood mentioned a temporary catering job at an exclusive seaside resort. Initially, Lucy didn't pay much attention to the offer. She couldn't imagine leaving her mother, not even for a few weeks. The mere thought of it gave her a knot in her stomach. But every time she looked at the mounting debts, she felt pressured to take action. That afternoon, while serving coffee to a customer at the restaurant, she thought about everything that was at stake. Her mother's well-being, the need to pay for medications, the rent, and the possibility of a more stable future. She found it hard to believe that a temporary job could solve so many problems, yet she also sensed a glimmer of hope she wasn't willing to ignore. She decided to gather her courage and ask for more details from the acquaintance who'd told her about the resort. The man, a regular customer at the restaurant, explained that one of his cousins worked on the events management team at that luxurious place. He mentioned that because of the high season, they needed extra staff for receptions and banquets. He also clarified that the pay was good, as the demands were high and the guests were people with plenty of spending power. Lucy listened carefully, though her first impulse was to dismiss the idea of traveling so far away from her mother. Still, after thinking it through, she realized this might be her only real chance to earn enough to pull herself out of this financial crisis. Besides, the job would last for a limited period, so she could return soon and care for Mrs. Elizabeth with more resources. Convinced, Lucy shared the news with her mother that same evening. Mrs. Elizabeth, sitting in the living room armchair, listened with a worried frown at the thought of being left alone. Her health had deteriorated so much that she could barely stand or walk a few steps. However, she recognized her daughter's courage and understood that this might be the sacrifice they needed to get ahead. In a trembling voice, she told Lucy she understood the situation and wouldn't oppose the plan. Lucy, both excited and afraid, promised to send money home as soon as she received her first paycheck. She knew her mother's illness required constant care, but she held out hope that a few neighbors might visit and help look after Mrs. Elizabeth in her absence. After dealing with the final details, Lucy packed a small suitcase. She carefully placed a photo of Mrs. Elizabeth inside, along with her own changes of clothes and a couple of keepsakes that inspired her. An old silver bracelet that once belonged to her grandmother, and a little scrapbook where she jotted down new recipes for the restaurant. She said goodbye to her mother with an embrace that felt endless, the pain of parting for the first time weighing on her heart. Then she boarded a bus leaving at night for the coast, a trip that would take all night. As the vehicle rumbled along dusty highways, Lucy stared out the window, unable to sleep, wondering if she was truly making the right decision. A tingling sensation fluttered in her stomach, a mix of excitement for the unknown and sadness at leaving home behind. Arriving at the coastal city in the morning, Lucy was dazzled by the scenery. Rows of palm trees lined the avenues, a radiant sun shone overhead, and the smell of the sea greeted her with a warm breeze. The resort stood out amid the tropical surroundings, enormous blue pools, meticulously designed gardens, and a grand lobby with marble columns that projected wealth and sophistication. Lucy felt small in the face of such opulence, coming from a humble neighborhood and never having imagined setting foot in such a luxurious place. Nonetheless, she mustered her courage and presented herself at the Human Resources office, where a serious yet polite manager greeted her. On her first day of training, Lucy and the other new employees learned the service protocols. They were taught everything from the proper posture when assisting guests to how to arrange napkins correctly on the tables. For Lucy, it was all new and somewhat overwhelming. It wasn't just about serving food. It had to be done with elegance and discretion, surrounded by magnates and influential people. She found it difficult to get used to the immaculate uniform, a crisp white shirt, a black knee-length skirt, a refined apron, and stylish shoes, which, though they matched the outfit, were anything but comfortable for long shifts. Yet, whenever she remembered why she was there, she forced herself to keep her head high and wear a cordial smile. As the day wore on, Lucy felt the accumulated fatigue of the trip and the hours spent on her feet. Still, the promise of decent wages and the chance to help her mother pushed her to keep going. The atmosphere, though refined, felt cold. Many of her co-workers seemed focused on standing out or pleasing the bosses in hopes of getting promoted. Lucy, on the other hand, saw it as a straightforward mission: work as hard as she could, save money, and get back home. In the afternoon, she managed a brief break and stepped out onto one of the resort balconies to admire the view. The beach stretched into the distance, its calm waves glistening under the sun. That moment renewed her hope. Maybe life really did have a chance in store for her. When the sun began to set, the sky took on orange and pink hues that seemed unreal. Finally freed from her first day's tasks, Lucy wandered to the water's edge. She felt the sand beneath her feet and the gentle sea breeze on her face. Her thoughts drifted to Mrs. Elizabeth, imagining how much her mother would enjoy this setting if she were healthy. A pang of sadness went through her, but she quickly turned it into resolve. She vowed to herself that no matter how challenging the job might be, she wouldn't let this opportunity slip through her fingers. She touched the old silver bracelet on her wrist, determined to pour every drop of energy into earning the necessary money. Closing her eyes, she listened to the waves, feeling a mix of exhaustion and hope she could hardly describe. With night falling over the resort, Lucy returned to her shared room, simple quarters provided for temporary staff. She climbed onto the top bunk and reflected on everything that had happened in just one day. The overnight journey, the splendor of the place, the rigorous training, and the sense of not quite fitting into that luxurious world. Still, her goal was clear. She knew every small discomfort would be worthwhile if it meant ensuring Mrs. Elizabeth's well-being. Before exhaustion overwhelmed her, she got out of bed, walked over to the window, and gazed once more at the moonlit sea. In that moment, awash in serenity and longing, her adventure truly began. Fatigue weighed on her shoulders, but deep down, she felt a monumental change on the horizon. At the end of that first day, she stood gazing at the vast darkness of the ocean, aware that her work was only beginning. Everything at the resort seemed designed for people of the highest rank, and she was just a simple young woman with dreams and insecurities. Yet rather than feeling intimidated, she sensed a surge of courage flare up in her heart. She knew her determination would help her overcome any obstacle, and that destiny, from that moment on, had much to reveal to her. The days leading up to the grand reception went by with unusual speed for Lucy. From dawn until late at night, she rehearsed along with the rest of the team how to serve properly, the right way to offer drinks, and the protocol for handling any unforeseen incidents. The resort had announced an important welcome event aimed at high-profile investors, placing everyone in a state of constant alertness and perfectionism. Despite being recently hired, Lucy had proven herself meticulous and responsible, so the supervisors trusted her to be part of the contingent that would serve at this exclusive gathering. On the morning of the big day, the sky was clear, and the sea shone with a turquoise hue that highlighted the garden's beauty. However, Lucy barely had time to admire the landscape. As soon as she got up, she slipped into the immaculate uniform the resort required for special occasions, a fine white blouse and a perfectly pressed black skirt. She donned low-heeled shoes, slightly more elegant than those she wore daily, and pinned her hair into a simple bun. Even so, she felt a slight tremor in her hands, the nerves provoked by the idea of coming face-to-face with influential, wealthy people. The main hall was expansive, adorned with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and exotic floral arrangements on marble tables. Under that golden lighting, guests began arriving around midday. Lucy, along with her co-workers, set out trays bearing gleaming glasses and gourmet appetizers. From a small corner of the room, she caught snippets of hushed conversations in multiple languages: English, Arabic, French, and more. Little by little, the bustle grew. Men and women in impeccable suits walked around confidently, exchanging business cards and formal greetings. For anyone unaccustomed to high society circles, the atmosphere could be intimidating. It was in the midst of this bustle that Lucy began hearing the name Rasheed al-Salim. While passing by with her tray, she overheard some guests mention him with admiration or discreet wariness. One person murmured that he was extremely influential in the energy sector, another brought up international trade agreements, and yet another mentioned he came from a very powerful family in the Middle East. Lucy didn't fully grasp the magnitude of these comments, but her curiosity was piqued. Who could this man be, generating such varied reactions? As these thoughts swirled in her mind, she carried on with her task. She moved among clusters of attendees, offering glasses of champagne and small canapes. Keen to do her job as efficiently as possible, she mostly went unnoticed, with no other concern than making sure the guests felt well attended. However, precisely as she attempted to weave through a large group, the first big scare of the evening struck. A slight accidental shove, or maybe just too many people in one spot, threw Lucy off balance. The tray of drinks she was carrying nearly slipped from her hands, threatening to spill its contents on some of the event's most distinguished guests. A sudden surge of panic shot through her when she sensed the glasses shaking and the bubbly liquid poised to splash onto the expensive suits. At that exact moment, a tall, poised man intervened with almost surgical precision. Swiftly, he steadied the tray from underneath, preventing the glasses from crashing to the floor. Lucy, heart pounding, looked up to thank the stranger who had saved her from a terrible mishap, and the first thing she noticed was the intensity in his eyes. They held a distinct glow, warm, yet filled with determination. "Are you all right?" he asked in a calm voice, speaking Spanish fluently, but with a slight foreign accent. Lucy swallowed hard and nodded nervously. For a moment, it felt as though everything around her had frozen in time, while the background music and the buzz of conversations seemed far away. The man gently let go of the tray, and she regained her composure, lowering her gaze to avoid appearing too inquisitive. Yet, he didn't walk away at once. "Please forgive me. I didn't mean—" Lucy began, trying to explain. "No, don't worry. These things happen," he replied kindly. Then he offered a small, polite bow. "My name is Rasheed Al-Salim, and yours?" Lucy froze at the sound of that name. It was the same she'd been hearing about just minutes earlier. Was she really standing in front of the renowned magnate who had everyone on edge? With her voice unsteady, she introduced herself, hoping he wouldn't notice her unease. "Lucy Morales, sir." "Pleased to meet you," she managed to say, barely. He smiled, and there was an unexpected warmth in that expression for someone of his status. From what she'd heard, she might have expected a distant or even arrogant demeanor, but Rasheed seemed genuinely concerned about whether she was all right. After a few seconds, he glanced around, noticing that several people were looking their way, intrigued by the scene. He took his leave discreetly. "It's a pleasure, Lucy. I hope we can talk later when things aren't so hectic," he said, flashing a courteous smile. Lucy remained standing there, bewildered, her heart still racing. She wondered why such a famous mogul would want to speak to her again, a mere catering employee. Even so, her surprise didn't keep her from returning to her duties. Carefully rearranging the glasses on the tray, she continued circulating among the guests, trying to steady her breathing. She noticed that some of the attendees who had witnessed the incident whispered among themselves, though no one showed any outright negativity. The reception carried on normally for a couple more hours. Soft instrumental music filled the room while business people and shareholders engaged in talks. Lucy observed that Rasheed stayed surrounded by several people, all hanging on his words. Every now and then, he would glance up, seemingly trying to spot her in the crowd. The thought made her smile inwardly, though she couldn't deny that just remembering him made her feel a little intimidated. Why would he single her out among so many influential figures? As evening wore on, the guests gradually toned down their socializing. Some went to the terraces to watch the sunset, while others wrapped up meetings in private rooms. Lucy helped her co-workers collect empty glasses and plates, preparing the hall for the formal dinner scheduled to begin in a few hours. She wondered if she would cross paths with that man again, and what she might say if she did. Her thoughts bounced back and forth between maintaining her professionalism and her growing curiosity about his sudden kindness. Once she felt she'd finished for the moment, she stepped into a quieter hallway to recover from the stress. She slipped off her shoes for a few seconds to rest her aching feet when she heard a muffled sound. In the distance, she caught sight of Rasheed walking away at a brisk pace. Though his dignified bearing remained, something in his expression was different now, a clear sign of worry. He was clutching a phone and speaking in a firm, perhaps angry tone. Lucy guessed it was an important call, presumably a business matter she shouldn't interfere with. Still, she found herself unable to look away. Rasheed exited the main hall through a side door leading to a private corridor. Lucy glimpsed how his expression darkened, his jaw clenched, and his gestures revealed a disquiet that seemed unrelated to finances. He looked like a man discussing something personal and sensitive. It was jarring, considering his earlier display of kindness. She watched him for a few more seconds, hesitating to approach, but decided not to interrupt. Something about him suggested he was carrying a heavier burden than he let on. Moments later, Lucy refocused on her job. Still, she couldn't shake the image of Rasheed with that worried look. Perhaps it wasn't her business, but she couldn't help wondering what kind of problem might trouble someone who appeared to have it all, or at least everything money could buy. Lucy understood the world of millionaires could be just as complex and full of intrigue as the humble life she knew. Yet witnessing that vulnerability in Rasheed left a deep impression on her, stirring a sense of compassion she didn't dare admit. As night drew near, the remaining guests slowly departed for their rooms or sought other areas of the resort to enjoy. The music, now much softer, accompanied the scattered murmurs of those who lingered in the hall. Exhausted and hungry, Lucy decided to take a brief break to recharge before continuing her dinner shift. On her way to the staff area, her thoughts kept drifting back to Rasheed al-Salim and the considerate way he had stepped in that afternoon. Upon sitting down on a chair in the break area, she drank a glass of water and closed her eyes for a moment. She tried to grasp what intrigued her so much about that man. His open smile, his courteous attitude, even the way he had rescued her from that mishap with the glasses. Everything seemed to defy the stereotypical image she held of tycoons, distant, conceited individuals who barely noticed their employees. Rasheed, on the other hand, had shown genuine interest and an uncommon empathy. When Lucy emerged from her reverie, she realized she probably wouldn't see Rasheed again until the next event. But she was left with an indescribable feeling. She had a hunch that this first encounter wouldn't be the last, and that behind his kind demeanor lay a story brimming with nuances she was only just beginning to sense. Remembering the worried look on his face filled her with more questions than answers, stirring a blend of curiosity and empathy deep within. After all, that night had proven that not all that glitters in high society is pure luxury and comfort. Perhaps behind the facade of wealth lay problems and secrets hovering like shadows over the prestigious name of Rasheed al-Salim. In the days following the big investors' reception, the resort was abuzz with frenetic activity. Lucy hardly had time to process what had happened at the event, especially that close call with the drink tray and Rasheed al-Salim's intervention. Her co-workers, wrapped up in preparations for other high-end gatherings, went on and on about how smoothly everything had turned out, never noticing the shock Lucy had felt in the middle of the hall. Meanwhile, she kept up with her daily service duties, always discreet and never mentioning her unforeseen interaction with that magnate. A couple of days later, she took advantage of a brief midday break to head out to the staff terrace, a modest spot from which a small stretch of the beach was visible. It was a peaceful corner, far from the constant coming and going of the guests. Lucy leaned on the railing and shut her eyes, enjoying the sea breeze. She only wanted a few minutes to clear her head before going back to the routine. That was when she heard soft footsteps behind her, and upon turning around, she found herself face to face with Rasheed's penetrating gaze. "Hello," he greeted, with a calmness Lucy found almost hypnotic. "Sorry to interrupt. I know you're on your break, but I was wondering if you'd join me for some tea." She blinked, startled that he had sought her out so deliberately. She considered declining for fear of breaking some resort rule, but something in Rasheed's expression encouraged her to accept. Curiosity and caution mixed within her, since she still couldn't fathom why someone so powerful insisted on speaking with her. Even so, she nodded slightly and picked up her small bag, prepared to follow him. Rasheed led her to a more secluded terrace, an almost hidden corner of the complex draped in vines overlooking the ocean. A small glass table with a simple bouquet of flowers awaited them, surrounded by two comfortable chairs. There, a waiter served tea in elegant porcelain cups. Lucy sat down, moving carefully to avoid seeming too casual, and Rasheed did likewise across from her. "I wanted to thank you for your dedication at the event," he remarked, holding his teacup with quiet poise. "Everyone's talking about how flawless the service was, and I'm certain your contribution was essential. I also wanted to make sure the incident with the tray didn't cause you any trouble." Lucy managed a small, still nervous smile. "No, don't worry about that. Honestly, it was just a scare. I'm glad you saved me from a big mishap," she replied, trying to sound casual. For a few minutes, they both sipped their tea in silence. The sea breeze caressed the terrace, and the soft roar of the waves lent a serene tone to their conversation. Lucy, who had never spent time with people of this social tier, was amazed to see Rasheed so relaxed, willing to discuss everyday matters. Suddenly, he asked about her life. "Tell me about yourself, Lucy. How did you end up working here?" She shrugged slightly. She wasn't used to opening up to strangers, much less someone of such high stature. Yet Rasheed's warmth and apparent sincerity made her feel somewhat more at ease. She told him she came from a humble neighborhood that her mother was ill, and that she had taken this job to escape a dire financial situation. He listened intently without interrupting, nodding once in a while or asking gentle questions, as though he genuinely wished to understand her circumstances. When Lucy mentioned her mother's chronic condition, she noticed a flicker of profound empathy in Rasheed's face. She confessed that her greatest dream was to see Mrs. Elizabeth receiving proper care, free from the worries of affording medication. "That must be really difficult," he murmured with a sigh. "Sometimes life puts us in complicated scenarios. My family—" Rasheed paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, they're also dealing with tensions. Our company has grown over time, but that's led to internal conflicts and clashing opinions. I feel like I'm constantly trying to keep everyone satisfied." Lucy tilted her head, intrigued. "That must be a lot of pressure. People assume that those with money live free of worries, but I suppose everyone carries their own burdens." Rasheed went quiet. A fleeting shadow passed across his gaze. Then he smiled, though it held a certain wistfulness. "You're right. Money doesn't fix everything. I've studied in different countries and seen a lot of realities. Now I'm trying to do something meaningful to help others. Sometimes my family doesn't fully agree with that vision, and well, that sparks some arguments." A subtle chill ran through Lucy. She hadn't imagined that, behind Rasheed's polite exterior, there might be a background of familial conflict. While they kept talking, his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it, frowned, and quickly stowed it away. He apologized briefly, then switched topics, asking her more about her interests, her hobbies, and whether she'd had the chance to study. She answered sincerely, explaining that she'd been unable to finish college due to a lack of resources, but that she loved reading and learning new things. Rasheed's warm demeanor eased all her insecurities. He even coaxed a shy laugh out of her when he related an anecdote from his student days in Europe. Once he got lost in an airport and ended up asking for directions in the wrong language, causing a rather embarrassing scene. Their laughter was mutual, and for the first time, Lucy felt that despite the huge gap between their worlds, they could connect on a personal level. After that first talk on the terrace, days passed, and Rasheed continued to show up during Lucy's breaks. Sometimes they bumped into each other in the hallways. Other times, he would find her in the employees' dining area or invite her for a stroll in the gardens at dusk. Gradually, her initial intimidation gave way to a sense of closeness. Although Lucy still didn't understand why someone so influential was paying attention to her, she couldn't help feeling her heart pound harder whenever he was near. Frequently, Rasheed's phone would ring, or he'd receive messages that instantly turned his demeanor serious. He never went into detail, but Lucy guessed it had to do with family issues or business disputes. Even so, when he was with her, he tried to set aside those cares. Their conversations revealed a sensitive, considerate man who showed a real concern for social and community matters. He spoke of educational initiatives he wanted to launch in his home country, the urgent need to support the most vulnerable populations, and his aspiration to leave behind a legacy that went beyond a well-stocked bank account. That's how a little over a week slipped by. The afternoons Lucy had off often coincided with the times Rasheed managed to break free from his commitments. During those precious hours away from the resort's formalities, they would walk along the shoreline, with the sun slowly sinking into the horizon. He helped her remove her shoes so she could feel the sand between her toes as the sea breeze tousled her hair. In those moments, their laughter flowed easily. Rasheed listened closely when she talked about her mother, her nostalgia for the old neighborhood, and the constant struggle to make ends meet. Lucy, in turn, was entranced each time he shared stories of his life abroad, of his travels, and of the intense demands placed on a member of the Salim family. One afternoon, after finishing one of those walks, they sat down on a rock close to the shoreline, watching the sunset. The golden light reflected on the surface of the sea, making the whole view shimmer with a romantic, unreal tint. Lucy felt a nervous twinge when Rasheed came closer and gently took her hand. Her skin tingled, and she realized that something had changed in their relationship. It was no longer just a casual friendship. There was a bond that grew stronger with every confession and every shared smile. "Lucy," he said softly, "ever since I met you, something inside me has shifted. I don't know how to explain it. I'm used to being around people who act cold or self-interested. But you're different. You're sincere. You have a huge heart. And most importantly, you inspire me to be a better person." She lowered her gaze, feeling the heat rise to her cheeks. She knew something was happening between them, but hearing it stated so plainly overwhelmed her. She forced herself to look into his eyes and saw a mix of tenderness and resolve. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Thank you for your words. I also feel very comfortable with you, but I don't want this to be a passing illusion." Rasheed shook his head and squeezed her hands a bit more firmly. "Neither do I. I want you to know that, if you'll allow me, I don't just want to see you on these walks or during breaks. I'd like us to think about something more profound. I understand your life isn't easy, and that there are many differences between us. But in spite of all that, I long to know you better, to be there for you, and for you to count on me." Lucy felt tears threatening to well up in her eyes. She had never dreamed of anything like this, let alone expected someone like Rasheed, coming from such a different world, to see her in that way. She nodded silently and let him wrap her in an embrace, with the sea breeze as their witness. It was a brief moment, but laden with promises. They stayed like that until the sky turned a violet hue and the sound of the waves reminded them it was time to go back. However, just as warmth and closeness filled the air, Rasheed's phone rang again. He stood up, frowning, and apologized as he moved a few steps away to take the call. Lucy watched him from the corner of her eye, noticing how his expression darkened. After a couple of minutes, he returned, trying to hide his concern. He took a deep breath and looked at her with a mixture of regret and urgency. "I'm sorry. I have to go. There's something I must deal with immediately," he explained, a hint of frustration in his voice. "But please, don't worry. I'll come back to ask you an important question." "An important question," Lucy repeated, feeling her nerves flare up again. "That's right. I promise." He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead and left with quick steps, leaving her brimming with questions and her heart in suspense. Lucy stood there, staring at the horizon, not entirely sure what to think. The man who had just enveloped her in such tenderness was now rushing off, radiating a sense of mystery that unsettled her. Even so, his words about something more profound echoed powerfully within her, awakening a hope she had never felt before. There was no doubt something momentous was about to happen in her life, although she couldn't begin to guess the magnitude of what fate had in store. The week following Lucy and Rasheed's last meeting was filled with intense moments and a strange atmosphere that lingered throughout the resort. Lucy continued working her shifts, yet each free moment was devoted to meeting Rasheed, who kept receiving worrisome calls and displaying a tension he struggled to conceal. Even so, whenever they were together, he tried to push those shadows aside and focus on her, on the simplicity of her stories, and on the sincere happiness that her presence radiated. One afternoon, while Lucy was finishing her shift by the pool area, a co-worker approached to tell her that a guest was waiting for her in one of the resort's private gardens. Intrigued, she headed there, feeling a flutter of nerves at the idea that it might be Rasheed. Upon arrival, she found a luminous, romantic setting, hanging lanterns among the palm trees, flower petals forming a pathway, and, in the distance, a wooden pier stretching out into the sea. Lucy barely recognized that corner of the resort, as it was usually off-limits to the general public. She walked slowly, in awe of it all, until she came upon Rasheed, who was waiting by the wooden railing. He wore a simple yet elegant white shirt, and it was clear he had prepared every detail with care. When he saw her, he smiled and offered his hand. Lucy was at a loss for words. The scene felt unreal, almost like a dream. However, she instantly sensed that something important was about to take place. Her heart raced as Rasheed guided her to the far end of the pier, where the sea breeze brushed against their faces and the waves quietly lapped at the supports beneath them. "Lucy," he began, his voice both gentle and firm, "I know our lives are very different, and I know all this has happened unusually fast, but I can't ignore what I feel every time I'm with you. I want you by my side, not just now, but always. I want to offer you more than walks by the shore or chats at sunset." Lucy felt her hands tremble. Her eyes widened with surprise when Rasheed took out a small velvet box and knelt before her. Suddenly, it was as if the entire world went silent, even the wind holding its breath. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice shaky yet determined. "I know this might seem rushed, but I want to protect you, to build a future with you. I don't want you to struggle or worry about your mother or your stability. I will take care of you, and together we can face whatever comes." Lucy felt a whirlwind of emotions: joy, uncertainty, tenderness, and fear. She had begun to love him, that much she knew, but the proposal unsettled her by its haste and the vast divide between their worlds. She thought of her mother, the poverty she was fleeing, and all the sacrifices she had made to get here. Was it really wise to take such a big step? Still, when she saw the sincerity in Rasheed's eyes, she realized this was no mere whim for him. In his gaze, she saw genuine love and an urgent desire. I don't know what to say," she whispered, words getting caught in her throat. "It's so soon. I'm scared of all it implies." Rasheed stood up gently, took her hands in his, and pressed them over his heart. He then looked at her with an intensity that disarmed her completely. "I understand. Believe me, I do. But there are things you still don't know about my family and my plans. I need you to trust me. I promise I'll explain it all. Just give me your hand and walk by my side." The determined glint in his eyes moved Lucy profoundly. She sensed he was fighting against something she couldn't fully grasp, and that he needed her support and presence to keep hope alive. After a few moments of silence, Lucy nodded slightly, tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, I'll marry you." Deeply moved, Rasheed held her in an embrace that felt everlasting. The salty breeze and the distant crash of the waves were their only witnesses in that moment. Lucy realized that, as uncertain as the future might be, she could not deny the love that had come into her life in such an unexpected way. The wedding was organized at a dizzying pace. Leveraging his influence, Rasheed managed to have the resort arrange a small ceremony in an elegant hall near the beach. Only a civil officer and a few incidental witnesses were needed to make the marriage official. On Lucy's side, 2 of her co-workers attended, taken aback by the sudden news, but happy to accompany her. Rasheed had the support of a close friend, an unassuming man who seemed well aware of the tensions within the Salim family. Wearing just a simple white dress she could afford, Lucy felt a blend of joy and anxiety. With every step down the aisle, a knot tightened in her throat. Her hands trembled as she walked toward the makeshift altar where Rasheed stood, beaming in a black suit. Part of her questioned the haste of this union, yet her heart told her that even so, she couldn't pass up the chance to love and be loved, to leave behind a life of hardship, and to provide her mother with the care she so desperately needed. The ceremony was brief, with no great pomp. The official recited the vows, and in a single breath, Lucy and Rasheed signed the papers that officially bound them in matrimony. The witnesses offered timid applause before a small champagne toast. Lucy stared at the glass's reflection in the light, feeling as though she was caught in a dream. When Rasheed took her hand, the warmth of his touch filled her with confidence, reassuring her that all would be well. "You'll soon understand my reasons," he whispered in her ear after congratulating her. "I just ask for a little patience." Blushing and overwhelmed, she nodded, returning his smile. The celebration was as discreet and brief as he had promised. That night, they retired to the honeymoon suite, one of the resort's most exclusive, boasting immense windows that faced the sea. Lucy gazed at the moon's reflection on the waves and allowed herself to dream, if only for a moment, that from then on, her life might be less painful and brighter. Exhausted by the wedding's intensity, they both lay on the spacious bed, worn out but happy. Holding her in his arms, Rasheed kept repeating that he would explain everything the next day, that she should trust him. With her head on his chest, Lucy was lulled by his breathing and scent, drifting off to sleep. It felt like a fairy tale, and she was grateful, though a small voice reminded her that something strange lurked behind the scenes. The first ray of sunlight woke her. Lucy stretched with languid slowness, feeling for Rasheed, only to find that he wasn't by her side. She assumed he had gone to get breakfast or take care of his usual affairs, so she threw on a light robe and moved toward the adjoining sitting room, calling him softly. There was no reply. She went from room to room, her heart racing all of a sudden. Reaching the balcony door, she noticed it was slightly ajar, the sea breeze rustling the curtains. Leaning outside, the sight that greeted her hit like a hammer blow. There, sprawled on the ground, was Rasheed, his eyes closed and his face pale, motionless. "Rasheed!" Lucy screamed, consumed by indescribable panic. She rushed to him and knelt, feeling the blood drain from her own face. Trembling, she tried to revive him, but there was no response. His skin was cold, and she couldn't sense even the faintest breath. Amid the chaos, Lucy glimpsed a broken glass lying a few inches from his hand and a couple of small bottles she didn't recognize. Horror wiped her mind blank. Sobbing, she fumbled for her phone and, with shaking fingers, called the front desk for help. Within minutes, security staff and a resort physician flooded into the suite, confirming with solemn looks that Rasheed showed no signs of life. The shock was so severe that Lucy could barely stand. Local police soon arrived, their sirens echoing down the hallway like sinister harbingers of tragedy. As the room filled with strangers combing over the scene, Lucy could only stare at her husband's lifeless body. He still wore the ring she had slipped onto his finger the night before, when everything felt like a dream of love. Now, that symbol glinted under the cold morning light, a stark contrast to Lucy's shattered expression. She couldn't understand how fate could be so cruel. The authorities examined the balcony and began asking if she had seen anything suspicious. Still in her nightgown, tears streaming down her cheeks, Lucy found herself surrounded by two officers who interrogated her relentlessly. When was the last time you saw him alive? What medications was he taking? Why are there bottles at the scene? Incapable of forming coherent answers, Lucy unraveled. None of it made sense. She kept telling herself that just last night they had been happy, that Rasheed had promised to explain everything, and now here he was, lifeless, an ending more tragic than any nightmare she could have imagined. At that moment, two police officers took notes while one warned her that she could not leave without authorization. Photographers flashed their cameras and murmurs rose from resort staff who had witnessed the commotion, heightening her panic. She felt their suspicious glances, as though they were silently accusing her of causing this inexplicable death. The weight of the calamity threatened to crush her. Amid the muddled voices and the flickering lights of sirens reflecting in the windows, Lucy raised her gaze, tears flowing without restraint. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat and grief as the officers surrounded her. Rasheed, the man who had filled her life with hope and love in such a short time, was gone in the most baffling, terrifying way. And with him, the promise of a new beginning seemed to crumble. The following day. The sun was already high when Detective Farhad Amin arrived at the resort, shortly after the horrifying discovery of Rasheed's body. He was a middle-aged man with defined features and a sharp gaze that spoke of long experience. He wore a dark suit at odds with the sweltering coastal heat, yet it didn't seem to bother him. Once inside, he headed straight for the suite where the tragedy had occurred. Staff and guards stepped aside respectfully, fully aware of the gravity of the case. The officer in charge greeted him with a terse nod and quietly laid out the details. "We have reason to believe this was a suspicious death. The deceased is Rasheed al-Salim, a very influential Arab businessman," the officer said in a hushed voice. His wife, Lucy Morales, was the one who found him. Apparently they got married just last night. Farhad's eyebrows shot up. He recognized the al-Salim surname from its extensive fortune and worldwide connections, precisely the kind of pedigree that could bring political and media pressure to a case like this. He stepped into the suite to examine the balcony where the body had been found, while forensic experts worked meticulously nearby. In the adjacent living room sat Lucy, flanked by two officers keeping a close watch on her. Still in her nightclothes, her face drawn and eyes swollen from crying, she looked up at the detective as he entered, clinging to the hope of finding some trace of empathy in his expression. Farhad studied her without passing immediate judgment, but the usual questions whirled in his mind. How likely was it that such a recent wife played no role in the death of her wealthy spouse? After reviewing the scene and hearing the forensics team's initial report, they couldn't confirm the cause of death yet, but were considering the possibility of an attack or poisoning. Farhad approached Lucy. She tried to explain in halting words. "I found him like that. He was on the balcony, not breathing. Please, believe me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Frowning, the detective jotted down what she managed to say, all the while scrutinizing her every gesture. Her emotions seemed genuine enough, but he knew better than to trust first impressions. The monetary motive was powerful, and it couldn't be ruled out. As Rasheed's brand new spouse, Lucy stood to inherit part of his fortune or assets. Ignoring that reality would be a grave mistake. As whispers about Rasheed's death spread through the halls, local media caught wind and swooped in, searching for headlines confirming the suspicious demise of an Arab millionaire. The resort scrambled to contain the scandal, hoping to keep its reputation intact, but the information leak was unstoppable. Reporters, cameras, and onlookers surged at the entrance, awaiting official statements from law enforcement or the resort staff. The resort's director wore a tense expression, coordinating with his security team on the best way to manage the crisis. A couple of hours later, Rasheed's immediate family from the Al-Salim clan arrived. Samira, Rasheed's mother, was the first to appear. Her distinguished bearing and black attire signaled a grief already set in motion, but failed to mask the fury smoldering in her gaze. As soon as she confirmed her son's body lying on the balcony, she broke down in tears and knelt beside him, cradling his lifeless form. Even amidst her wrenching sobs, she threw scathing looks at Lucy, whom she saw as an intruder. "Where is that woman?" she demanded, her voice trembling with pain. The detective tried to calm her, but Samira brushed aside the hand he offered and, with an aggrieved expression, pointed accusingly at Lucy. "She calls herself my son's wife? How can this madness be real?" Almost at the same time, Khalil, Rasheed's younger brother, appeared. His features faintly resembled those of the deceased, though he looked younger and far less imposing. Khalil approached Lucy, his steps marked by a palpable hesitation. His voice, though kind, was tinged with grief. "I'm so sorry. I can't believe what happened. Rasheed, he was my brother," he murmured, voice trembling, before lowering his head. Despite the tension, Khalil showed empathy, gently taking Lucy's hand. She thanked him for the gesture, but sensed the inner turmoil behind his gaze. He didn't seem to know whether to blame her or comfort her. Right behind them came Zaher, Rasheed's uncle. He had a stern, calculating presence, his brow permanently furrowed. Zaher looked at Lucy with absolute skepticism. "For heaven's sake, don't tell me this circus is real," he muttered quietly, though loud enough for all to hear. "My nephew secretly got married to someone who has nothing to do with our family. And this is the outcome?" He didn't openly accuse her, but his words dripped with judgment and venom. Then Noura, Rasheed's cousin, arrived, a woman of elegant bearing and a cold gaze. She scarcely paused to take in the scene before turning toward the detective. Introducing herself in a poised manner, she spoke in a courteous yet unmistakably haughty tone. "I am Noura al-Salim, Rasheed's cousin. I expect this matter to be handled with the discretion our family deserves." Meanwhile, the family's tension was palpable. Khalil looked mournful and bewildered. Samira sobbed over her son while whispering prayers under her breath, and Zaher's anger at the lightning-fast wedding was on full display. Noura, for her part, was already making calls and pulling strings, pressing local authorities to keep the investigation under control. Intimidated, Lucy felt like an outsider among them, all so different from her, staring at her with a mix of reproach and suspicion. Detective Farhad quickly grasped what was happening. The Al-Salim family had arrived in force, and Lucy stood in an extremely vulnerable position. Indeed, as Samira rose with dignity and dabbed at her tears, she leveled a severe look at Lucy. "I demand an explanation," she said in strained Spanish. "How dare this stranger marry my son without our consent? What kind of deception is this?" Lucy felt a knot tighten in her throat. She wanted to explain that it had been an act of love, a sincere impulse, but no words came out. She knew that in the eyes of the influential Al-Salims, her story would sound absurd or self-serving. "We fell in love," she managed in a broken voice. "Rasheed proposed. We married yesterday. He said he'd explain everything. I had nothing to do with his death, I swear." "Fell in love in a matter of days?" Zaher interjected mockingly. "What a way to take advantage of a good man. Did you plan all of this?" The accusation struck like a direct blow. Lucy wanted to respond, but all she managed was to tremble with indignation. Khalil carefully asked his uncle to calm down, while Noura picked up her phone once more, intensifying her calls. Samira remained standing, her eyes fixed on Lucy, without saying a word. Detective Farhad saw how complicated things were growing. A high-profile body, a powerful family, a newlywed wife who stood to gain economically, and rumors of possible poisoning, an explosive mix requiring delicate handling. With a firm tone, he turned to Lucy. "I need you to come with me, Miss. Or rather, Mrs. Morales. I have some more detailed questions to ask." Lucy turned her head in horror. She wanted to protest, to say she hadn't even had time to process her husband's death, but the detective's serious expression remained unchanged. Samira, Khalil, Zaher, and Noura looked on in silence as a pair of officers led Lucy toward the resort's secured area, now serving as a makeshift interrogation room. The murmurs grew louder in her wake, and Lucy felt each accusatory glance stab at her like 1,000 needles. Everything she had lived through in recent weeks, the marriage proposal, the wedding, the romantic walks, seemed to crumble under the weight of that terrifying moment. It was as though the perfect world she had just begun to taste had shattered. When she reached the door to the interrogation room, she heard the click of the lock behind her and felt a deep chill run through her. Lucy sat across from the table, hands tightly clasped to steady their trembling, while Detective Farhad and a few other officers watched her intently. Outside, the Al-Salim family argued heatedly, and hushed speculation of her alleged guilt grew steadily louder. Tension peaked, leaving Lucy staring into an abyss of uncertainty. Could she prove her innocence and, in doing so, expose what truly lay behind her husband's death? The resort, once a carefree holiday retreat, had become a place thick with tension and whispers. Rasheed's death brought intense media scrutiny and investigative pressure, creating an oppressive climate where the Al-Salims made their presence felt through distrustful stares and words. Meanwhile, Lucy waited anxiously for preliminary autopsy results, balanced on the edge of a breakdown. Staying true to his role, Detective Farhad Amin had already begun interrogating witnesses and reviewing security footage. He instructed his team to analyze the substances found on the suite's balcony. Meanwhile, the Al-Salim family barricaded themselves in one of the resort's private rooms, demanding immediate answers and a discreet approach that would protect their reputation. One morning, when Lucy returned to the interrogation room for another round of questioning, she was met with a surprise. A sober-looking man with a grave expression stood waiting, surrounded by several members of the Salim family. He wore a neatly pressed grey suit and carried a leather briefcase. Seeing her, he introduced himself in a composed voice. "I'm Omar Hussein, the family's attorney. I was called in to clarify certain issues regarding Rasheed's estate." Lucy felt a tight knot in her stomach, wondering if he had come to accuse her of opportunism. Even so, she noticed that Khalil, leaning against the wall, looked more confused than anything else, and Samira stood off to one side, silent but tense. Zahir and Noura had their arms crossed, brows furrowed, seemingly ready to launch verbal assaults at any moment. "Please take a seat," Omar said, carefully opening the briefcase. "I have here the will Rasheed updated a few days ago, right before traveling to the resort. I think it's best to read part of it now, so we can clarify the current status of his assets." The lawyer's words had an immediate effect. Samira shifted in her seat, her face still twisted by grief. Zahir shot a resentful look, and Noura formed a skeptical sneer. Khalil, on the other hand, appeared more attentive than displeased. Lucy, terrified as she was, wished to appear respectful. She placed her hands on her lap and tried her best to look composed. Omar pulled out some documents bearing an official letterhead. After a brief introduction regarding the legal validity of the will and the dates on which Rasheed's final wishes had been drafted, he continued in a calm tone. Mr. Salim, in his desire to reorganize his assets, stipulated that, in the event of a sudden death, his family would be responsible for distributing the estate equitably. However, he also added a clause concerning Lucy Morales, his new wife. That mention triggered an immediate stir. Samira, who until then had barely spoken, sat up straight with an incredulous expression. "A clause? What clause?" she asked, her voice trembling with anguish. Omar let out a sigh and went on. "The document states that Lucy Morales will be granted a significant share of the Salim company's stock and, in addition, will inherit certain real estate properties held in Rasheed's name." At that, the air grew even more charged. A murmur of protest escaped Zahir, who made no attempt to hide his disdain. But he'd barely met her. How could he decide to leave her a share of the company's stock? He snapped, glaring at Omar with furious eyes before turning them on Lucy. "This confirms my suspicion. Everything was a carefully orchestrated plan." Noura, in her typical haughty bearing, added her own accusations. "I said so from the start. This fairy tale was nothing more than a scheme to seize the Salim empire." Samira, for her part, got up abruptly. Even with grief etched across her face, she pointed a trembling finger at Lucy. "Do you see what you've done? You took advantage of my son? Did you think you could fool him and steal his fortune?" Lucy felt her chest tighten. She stood up too, trembling with a blend of outrage and fear. "Ma'am, I never wanted any of this. I had no idea about his will. I didn't even know Rasheed was thinking," she stammered, at a loss for the right words to express her disbelief. Her attempt to explain only inflamed matters further. Samira let out a choked sob, while Zahir and Noura shot looks of pure hostility at Lucy. The tension ran so high that Detective Farhad, present to take notes on everything, had to intervene. "Please everyone remain calm," he said with authority. "I understand this is delicate, but accusing each other without proof accomplishes nothing." Yet Zahir refused to relent. "Proof is exactly what we need, and so far, it all points to this girl marrying Rasheed in order to get hold of a major piece of the fortune. We should investigate whether she had an accomplice inside our circle." Clearing his throat, Attorney Omar stepped in to regain control of the conversation. He raised a hand, signaling for them to quiet down, and continued. "There's more. Before leaving for the resort, Mr. Salim gave me a sealed envelope with specific instructions. He then produced a cream-colored envelope, stamped with the initials RA in silver ink, and held it out to Lucy. She took it with trembling hands. Omar clarified. Rasheed asked that this envelope be given to his wife if anything happened to him. "Open it if something happens to me," he said. Those were his exact words. Instantly, dissent arose yet again. Zaher leaned forward, visibly enraged. Why? Why Lucy and not the family? Omar merely shrugged with professional composure. Those were his instructions. Noura and Samira exchanged distrustful looks. Khalil, however, gazed at the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Meanwhile, Lucy felt her heart about to burst. She only got a brief glimpse of Rasheed's handwriting, his firm, recognizable script. Inhaling sharply, she opened the envelope and pulled out several handwritten pages. In them, Rasheed described fears and uncertainties he had never shared with Lucy directly. He mentioned that in recent weeks he had detected a murky atmosphere around the family business, with suspicious transfers and maneuvers aimed at removing him from his leadership role in the company. Although no specific names were given, the text implied that he suspected certain close relatives, people who disapproved of his philanthropic vision and his plans to reform the company's practices. "Something tells me that if I don't give in, they might take drastic measures against me," Lucy read aloud in a trembling voice. "I don't know who to trust, but I won't surrender. If you're reading this, my love, it's because I feared the worst, and I hope you understand that I did this to protect you." Lucy's voice failed when she reached that final line. Those words confirmed her nightmare. Rasheed had feared for his life and had included her in his will, leaving her not just property, but an implicit warning. A surge of anger and sorrow coursed through her as she realized everything might have been avoided if he had exposed these threats earlier. Samira, hearing the summary of what was in the envelope, jerked her head abruptly, torn between believing or rejecting what she had just heard. Zaher, for his part, clicked his tongue in scorn. "Delusions, that's all. Those papers can't be worth anything, just random scribblings." Noura, always calculating, absorbed the news with clear skepticism, but said nothing for the moment. Khalil, however, covered his face with one hand, visibly shaken by what he was hearing. A brief silence fell, heavy with resentment and suspicion. Fighting back tears, Lucy looked at Detective Farhad, who stood to one side, busily taking notes without missing a detail. This proves Rasheed suspected someone close to him," Lucy said, her voice wavering. "I don't know anything about shady deals, and I don't want the fortune. But if he was murdered, please help me find the truth." Samira turned to the detective, her tear-filled eyes now brimming with reproach. "So now you're suggesting that someone in the family killed my son? Do you realize what you're saying?" Paralyzed by grief and fear, Lucy didn't know how to respond. By instinct, she clutched the papers against her chest. That testimony from Rasheed, seemingly his final message, was the only defense she had to prove that he truly loved her, and that there was a dark undercurrent within the Al-Salim family. Attorney Omar, sensing that the situation was on the verge of chaos, calmly gathered the official documents and spoke to everyone in a measured tone. "For the moment, that's all I have to say. The will is valid, and even if legal proceedings begin, Rasheed's stipulations have solid grounding. The assets he left to Lucy, according to the law, must be recognized unless some irregularity is proven." His words set off another wave of protests. Zaher and Noura launched into arguments, claiming it was a setup, while Samira remained silent, her devastated expression fixed squarely on Lucy. Under the pressure, Lucy felt short of breath. Detective Farhad declared the meeting over, saying he would continue investigating every detail. With an envelope in her hands and a shattered heart, Lucy realized that Rasheed's death was only the beginning of something far bigger. Revisiting the lines of his posthumous note, she glimpsed a world of intrigue where certain family members might have been willing to do anything to keep control of the company. She shuddered, fearing for her own safety. If she spoke out about what she'd read, they would turn on her even more fiercely. But if she stayed silent, she would never see justice done for the man she had loved. The choice wasn't easy, and the weight of that conspiracy began to fill her days with a dread that threatened to swallow her whole. Even so, she knew she couldn't give up. No matter how much the Salim family viewed her as an outsider, she was determined to uncover the truth behind Rasheed's mysterious death. Despite the constant tension hovering over the resort, the local police had opted not to detain Lucy while the investigation continued. She found herself in an uneasy limbo, not officially charged, yet under the watchful eyes of both the Salims and the authorities. After the partial reading of the will and the discovery of the sealed envelope, suspicions of possible homicide grew stronger. Still, the family's powerful connections made it difficult for the case to proceed through normal channels. Lucy drifted through the resort's hallways with a haunted gaze. She felt lonely, trapped in an emotional whirlwind that ate her up inside. She didn't even dare call her mother to explain what had happened, afraid of worrying her needlessly. Day by day, she overheard whispers and comments from other employees, who watched her with a blend of curiosity and distrust. She had gone from being an anonymous worker to the widow of a millionaire who died under mysterious circumstances. One afternoon, her heart pounding and Rasheed's envelope in her hands, Lucy decided she could no longer remain silent. She knew she was risking a great deal by revealing parts of her husband's final message, but she also understood it might be her best shot at uncovering the truth. Thus, she sought out Detective Farhad Amin, the same officer who had questioned her from the start, and asked to speak with him in private. She found him in one of the makeshift offices the police had set up within the resort. Detective Farhad, busy at a computer, looked up when she walked in. He seemed surprised at first, but signaled for her to take a seat. "I need you to hear something," Lucy said, holding the envelope with trembling hands. "Some of the information Rasheed wrote down before he died. I think it might help." Farhad leaned in, his expression serious, eyes full of focus. Lucy didn't reveal every single document. She feared putting herself in even greater danger. But she showed him several passages in which Rasheed voiced his suspicions about his own family. He hinted at dirty tactics to remove him from his position in the company and hinted that someone wanted him gone. The detective read carefully, brow furrowed, then turned to Lucy. "This is serious. It suggests Rasheed had enemies very close to him," he murmured. "Mrs. Morales, are you aware that if this leaks, there could be reprisals against you?" Lucy nodded. Her throat felt dry, but she knew it was time to speak honestly. "Yes, I know. But I can't stay silent, Detective. Rasheed included me in his will precisely because he was afraid of his family. If he feared they would eliminate him, why would he put me at the center of everything, knowing it could incriminate me?" Farhad held her gaze and nodded slowly. "That makes sense. If he suspected some relative wanted to get rid of him, adding you to the will wouldn't be the smartest tactic, unless he truly trusted you and wanted to protect you." That realization seemed to open a new perspective for the detective. In the early days, he had considered the possibility that Lucy had killed Rasheed out of financial self-interest, but now he saw glaring inconsistencies in that theory. Still, he had to tread carefully. He couldn't base the case solely on unproven assumptions. "I need more evidence," Farhad conceded after a brief pause, "and I'll look into the names mentioned in these notes. But you should know Zaher, Noura, and anyone else in the family can use their clout to pressure my superiors into pulling me off the case. This won't be easy." Lucy felt a spike of fear. She knew that accusing the Salim family of a possible murder could cost her dearly. Even so, seeing Farhad start to doubt her guilt gave her a faint glimmer of hope. "I understand," she whispered. "I don't know who to trust. Omar Hussein, the attorney, seems very neutral, but I worry he only takes instructions from the family. And Khalil, he's different from the rest, but he seems confused." The detective closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Proceed with caution, Mrs. Morales. Try to be discreet. I'll investigate Zaher and Noura further. I'm also curious about Khalil because I'm not sure whose side he's really on. After the conversation, Lucy left the office feeling slightly more at ease. At least she was no longer shouldering the most delicate information from Rasheed's envelope all by herself. She now had the detective's support, or at least his willingness, to see her as something more than a mere gold digger. Time would tell whether her bold move would bear fruit or turn against her. Hours crawled by. Lucy continued to stay in a modest room at the resort, unable to return home until the investigation ruled out her involvement in Rasheed's death. The days seemed endless, choked with uncertainty. Sometimes she crossed paths with Samira in the hallways or Noura in the lobby, sensing their icy, resentful stares. She only caught fleeting glimpses of Zaher, always flanked by private security. And Khalil, with his ambiguity, still greeted her courteously, yet never offered any clear information. One night, while trying to drift off to sleep, Lucy's mind was flooded with memories of her brief love story with Rasheed. The beachside walks, his sincere smile, the gentle way he touched her. A sharp pain came over her as she thought about the tragedy that had destroyed that promising future. She reproached herself for not being more insistent whenever she saw him uneasy about those phone calls. Maybe, if she had pushed him to share more details, things would have turned out differently. But the reality was unchangeable. Rasheed was dead, and someone might have killed him out of ambition. The next day, as she carefully went through the papers she'd been guarding, Lucy found something that made her pulse race. Among the pages filled with Rasheed's notes was a document she hadn't examined thoroughly before, copies of bank records and electronic transfers. One name stood out: Zaher. It showed large sums of money sent to overseas accounts, dated close to Rasheed's trip to the resort. Immediately, a knot formed in Lucy's stomach. Could this be the clue that confirmed her suspicions? She decided to look for Detective Farhad again, but at that moment, the phone in her room rang. Picking it up, she heard the quivering voice of a resort chauffeur who had also worked for the Al-Salim family. "Mrs. Lucy, I'm sorry to bother you, but I've heard rumors. And I need to confess something," the man said, swallowing hard. "I saw Zaher Al-Salim walking around near the suite the night your husband died. I didn't want to get involved. I thought it was just a family matter. But now I feel terrible. I'm not sure if this helps, but he seemed to be on the lookout, like he was expecting something." Lucy's heart skipped a beat. Her body bristled with a chill at the thought of Zaher prowling around the place where his nephew ended up dead. She tried to keep her voice calm so as not to scare the chauffeur. "Please, could you tell Detective Farhad about this? It might be crucial to solving the case." The man hesitated. He admitted fearing the reprisals of such an influential family who could ruin his life. Lucy understood his terror, but insisted the police needed his statement. If the resort employee could confirm seeing Zaher in the area on the night Rasheed died, a solid investigative lead might emerge. "All right, I'll talk to the detective, but it will take a lot of courage," the chauffeur finally agreed. Before hanging up, he added, "Be careful, Ma'am. Don't trust anyone." Lucy stayed there for a few seconds with the receiver in her hand, adrenaline pumping through her veins. The pieces were beginning to fit together. If she combined the evidence of Zaher's suspicious bank transfers with the chauffeur's testimony, it was plausible he had motive to eliminate Rasheed and gain more control of the company. And when Lucy unexpectedly entered the picture, since Rasheed had left part of his estate in her name, it could have provoked greater anger and fear in her uncle-in-law. She took a deep breath, sensing within herself the resolve of someone who can no longer turn back. She set out to organize the information to present it to Detective Farhad. She knew that by making these accusations, she was effectively declaring war on Zaher, and, in a way, on the rest of the Al-Salim family. Even so, she also understood that keeping silent would leave a possible crime unpunished. Most of all, honoring Rasheed's memory meant taking the risk of facing those responsible. That same night, in the half-light of her room, Lucy sat by the window with the documents on her lap. She felt the ocean breeze mingling with a stifling air of intrigue and fear. Glancing outside, she could see the silhouette of the tropical gardens, as beautiful as they were deceiving, hiding a network of paths in which more than one person seemed to be keeping secrets. She was on the verge of embarking on a crusade against the powerful Salim family, armed only with her determination and whatever help Farhad could offer. As she sorted through the evidence, Lucy realized her late husband had not died by chance. The growing suspicions indicated that his death was part of a family scheme, and a bitter certainty settled in her heart. Rasheed had fought against dark forces, and by marrying her, he had dragged her into that battle as well. The weight of the truth threatened to overwhelm her, yet at the same time it drove her to expose the machinations that had claimed the life of the man she loved. In the days after discovering the suspicious transfers and learning that Zaher had been skulking near Rasheed's suite on the night of his death, Lucy's situation became unbearable. The Al-Salim family, far from easing up on their distrust, intensified the pressure on her. Samira, Noura, and Zaher acted with a calculated coldness, and they soon leaked to the local press a story casting Lucy as nothing more than an opportunist who had tricked Rasheed into giving her his fortune. The news exploded like a media bomb. Sensationalist newspapers and news shows fed on the scandal, printing headlines that questioned Lucy's innocence and suggested her marriage to Rasheed was a cunning maneuver before she murdered him. Within the resort's corridors, whispers and wary looks multiplied. The employees, who initially had felt pity for Lucy, began to doubt her story under the avalanche of rumors. In the midst of this hostile climate, Detective Farhad Amin's investigation pressed on, but with mounting obstacles. Using her diplomatic and business connections, Noura pulled strings in the local police force to downplay the case or steer the spotlight toward Lucy. Farhad, aware of the threat this posed to his work, grew more cautious in his actions. He couldn't afford any mistake that might justify removing him from the investigation. Meanwhile, Lucy felt increasingly cornered. Random encounters with Zaher and Noura were tense. He stared her down with icy eyes, no attempt to hide his aversion, while Noura flashed a fake smile, making it plain she saw Lucy as an interloper. Samira, for her part, remained more distant, wrapped in a silent mourning. She exchanged no more than a few words with Lucy, always wearing a bitter expression. The young widow even considered fleeing and leaving everything behind, but her need to seek justice for Rasheed and her promise to uncover the truth kept her rooted in place, despite her fears. It was precisely her desperation that drove her to take a risky step, confront Samira. Lucy was convinced that Rasheed's mother, despite her anger, could not ignore the evidence linking Zaher and Noura to shady dealings. After requesting a private meeting, she managed to get Samira to agree to see her in a secluded room of the resort. Lucy arrived with her head bowed and her heart racing, carrying a small case that held copies of the documents implicating her uncle-in-law. Samira waited by the window, her back straight and her dark dress accentuating her mourning. When Lucy walked in, she felt the oppressive tension in the air. Rasheed's mother was staring off into the distance, and she didn't bother turning around until the young woman was standing quite close. "I don't have much time," Samira said curtly. "What did you want to see me about?" Lucy swallowed hard and opened the small case. Her hands were still shaking, but she understood that this was a critical move if she was going to dismantle the narrative portraying her as the true culprit. She placed some papers on the table, bank records indicating Zaher's irregular transactions, along with excerpts from Rasheed's notes warning of a possible conspiracy. "Please, ma'am," Lucy began, trying to sound respectful. "I need you to see this. These are documents tying Zaher to some suspicious money transfers, ones Rasheed considered shady. Several of them took place right before he died." Samira frowned, skeptical at first, but she couldn't help casting an eye over the documents. As she read, her breathing grew heavier. Lucy saw her gaze widen as she recognized signatures and dates that couldn't be mere coincidence. A deep silence settled over the room. "What are you trying to achieve with this?" Samira asked warily. "I don't want Rasheed's fortune. I don't even understand large-scale business," Lucy said in a pleading voice. "I just need you to know there's strong evidence his death wasn't an accident, that someone in your family wanted to get rid of him." Rasheed's mother turned her face away and stayed silent for a few seconds. A memory flitted through her mind. Past quarrels with Zaher, the times he had tried to seize certain family businesses when Samira's husband, Rasheed's father, began to fail in health. Those disputes had always caused internal conflict that eventually died down, or so she had believed. Even so, she still wasn't fully prepared to trust Lucy. "My family is complicated," Samira admitted, her voice breaking a little. "But why bring this to me and not to the police?" Lucy lowered her head, frustrated. "I've already spoken with Detective Farhad, but Noura and Zaher are using their connections to hinder the investigation. I feel like I'm all alone in this. Please, Mom, you're Rasheed's mother. If you help me prove what really happened, we can seek justice." Samira didn't answer right away. Lucy sensed the woman's inner turmoil in her eyes. After a long silence, Samira took a breath and picked up the papers once again, studying them carefully. "I don't trust you. Not after everything that's happened," she said in a trembling voice. "But I have to admit, these documents raise plenty of questions, and I can't deny Zaher has always been a bit too ambitious." Lucy felt a wave of relief mixed with sadness. This wasn't an unconditional alliance, but at least Samira no longer rejected her outright. However, before they could continue talking, the door flew open. Khalil, Rasheed's younger brother, stepped in, anger flashing in his eyes, and seemed startled to see Lucy there with his mother. "What's going on here?" he asked anxiously. "Khalil," Samira replied, trying to compose herself. "Lucy's showing me some documents that implicate Zaher in some shady dealings." Khalil's expression grew dark. Lucy noticed his lip quiver and his breathing quicken, as though a surge of guilt were suffocating him. "Mom, he began, unable to continue. Suddenly, Khalil sank into a nearby chair, covering his face with his hands. After several seconds, he started to sob. Neither Samira nor Lucy knew how to respond to his abrupt breakdown. Finally, Khalil looked up, his eyes brimming with remorse. "I've made so many mistakes. For months, Zaher and Noura led me to believe Rasheed wanted to take over the entire business and push me and Mom aside. They had me attend these meetings where they planned how to sideline Rasheed from the company. I never imagined they'd go so far as—" He trailed off, his voice faltering. "I never thought they'd kill him." His confession made Samira turn pale. She tried to comfort her son, while Lucy closed her eyes in sorrow, realizing her worst suspicions were confirmed. Zaher and Noura had been plotting against Rasheed, and Khalil, clouded by resentments and insecurities, had become an unwitting accomplice. "Detective Farhad will hear about this," Samira murmured, her voice trembling. "I won't let Rasheed's death go unpunished, Khalil. You just admitted you all conspired against him." "Please forgive me, Mom," Khalil sobbed. "At first, it seemed like a way to level the playing field. I felt inferior to Rasheed, and I was jealous. But once he was gone, everything changed. I never really understood him." Lucy watched them with a heavy heart. The youngest Salim had been manipulated, or at least drawn into, a plot far more sinister than he'd imagined. Though it didn't excuse what he'd done, she could see Khalil likely hadn't anticipated the scope of the consequences. A moment later, the door opened again, and a local police officer poked his head in to announce that Detective Farhad needed to see Samira and Khalil. Time was running out. As they left the room, Lucy glimpsed Samira's expression, a mixture of fury, pain, and resolve. Rasheed's mother had just seen firsthand that a sinister plan lay behind her son's death. And for the first time, Lucy did not feel the weight of Samira's disapproval. Instead, she sensed a fragile alliance forged by rage and a thirst for justice. With Khalil's confession on record, suspicion against Zaher and Noura grew stronger. Lucy and Samira, brought together by Rasheed's memory and their drive to learn the truth, knew a confrontation with the conspirators was inevitable. The threads of ambition and betrayal binding the Al-Salim family were hurtling toward a dangerous climax, where money and power seemed enough reason for the ugliest of acts. Meanwhile, Detective Farhad had to tread carefully, unable to back down now if he truly wanted to expose this deadly conspiracy. Over the following days, after Khalil's confession and the mounting evidence against Zaher and Noura, the atmosphere at the resort grew even more tense. Samira, determined to seek justice for her son, cooperated with Detective Farhad Amin, supplying further information about internal family feuds and suspicious financial dealings. Meanwhile, Lucy lived under constant fear of being attacked or framed, now that the Al-Salims realized she wasn't just a passive victim. Amid this climate, Zaher, feeling cornered by the accusations and the likelihood of imminent police action, contacted Lucy, promising a way to negotiate an exit. His approach was unsettling, a curt text message, coupled with a phone call that, while brief, brimmed with threats disguised as proposals. "If you really want to clear your name," Zaher said coolly, "we have to meet. I'm the only one who can help end this media circus. But you'll need to bring along every document Rasheed left behind." Lucy felt a jolt of fear. She knew Zaher was on the defensive now, making him all the more dangerous. But she also recognized this might be her chance to expose him once and for all. Taking a deep breath and faking as much calm as she could, she agreed to meet. Right away, she phoned Detective Farhad, sharing Zaher's offer in detail. Samira found out and didn't hesitate to give her support, though the betrayal within her own family clearly pained her. Khalil insisted on joining them, regret gnawing at him for having unwittingly, or out of jealousy, helped drive Rasheed away from the company and, ultimately, to his death. "Be careful, Lucy," the detective warned her before everything was arranged. "Zaher's cunning. Don't put any faith in his words. We'll be close by, ready to step in." With the documents tucked under her arm, Lucy waited for Zaher's final instructions. Eventually, a message arrived, directing her to a secluded family villa on the outskirts of the coastal city. It was neither a public space nor a busy one, confirming the likelihood of a setup. Even so, Lucy pushed forward. She steeled herself and arrived at the meeting with her heart pounding, trusting that Farhad and his team would appear at the right moment. The villa turned out to be an old structure with towering walls and a wrought iron gate that screeched when pushed open. Lucy shivered as she walked through the unkempt garden, everything bleak and deserted, as though no family gathering had taken place there for a very long time. Stepping into the main foyer, she spotted Noura at the far end, arms crossed, wearing an unsettling, steely expression. She was dressed in a sleek suit, more apt for a corporate negotiation than a family encounter. "Where are the documents, Lucy?" Noura asked bluntly, leading her to a sitting room filled with antique furniture. From the shadows, Zaher emerged wearing a smile so out of place it made Lucy's stomach lurch. He had on a dark suit and a piercing gaze, like someone confident he still held the upper hand. Nearby stood two stocky men, clearly private security, ready to intervene if things spiraled. "Thank you for coming," Zaher said with feigned courtesy. "First of all, I want you to know I mean you no harm. In fact, we can make your troubles with the law disappear if you cooperate." Lucy pursed her lips, trying not to show her nerves. She knew the police would arrive eventually, but she couldn't rush the outcome. To maintain the charade, she produced a folder containing copies of the documents, not the originals. Zaher moved in, eager to inspect them, but Lucy stepped back. "First, explain to me how you plan on helping me," she demanded, her voice sounding firmer than she felt inside. Noura stepped forward with a grim expression. "We know your reputation is in shambles, dear. You're being painted as the main suspect in Rasheed's murder. But if you hand over all the information and sign a document renouncing the inheritance," she lifted a folder resting on the table, "we'll guarantee the Al-Salim family won't pursue legal action against you. You can walk away, and we'll clean up your image in the media." Lucy noticed this folder had more papers in it than Noura let on. Zaher, catching her stare, responded with a cynical smile. "So do it. Sign here, and you'll have no more problems from us. And of course, give me the original documents my nephew left behind. I'm well aware you've been sharing them with that reckless detective." Heart thumping in her chest, Lucy opened the folder and skimmed it. It didn't just contain text about renouncing Rasheed's inheritance. There was also a section leveling false accusations that she had plotted her husband's death. Clearly, Zaher and Noura intended to force her into incriminating herself, or, at the very least, destroy any lingering faith in her innocence. "You think I'm stupid," she retorted, surprising herself with her boldness. "This is nothing but a trap to make it look like I'm admitting guilt." Zaher tilted his head, clicking his tongue. "Don't make this harder, woman. It's in your best interest, or we'll end your life some other way," he threatened in a low voice, signaling to the two guards. Lucy pretended to give in. Hand trembling, she brought the pen near the first line of the document. Seconds felt like hours, and she silently prayed Detective Farhad would show up. Just as she was about to sign, a loud clamor burst from the far end of the house. Heavy pounding sounded at the front door, and Farhad's voice boomed, "Police, open the door!" That was the cue. Zaher's security men sprinted to block the entrance, while Noura cursed under her breath. Zaher, his face flushing with rage, lunged at Lucy, trying to snatch the folder from her hands. She recoiled, shielded by the chaos erupting in mere seconds. From the rear of the villa came shouts and hurried footsteps. Detective Farhad's team forced their way in, quickly disarming the guards. "Let me go!" Zaher bellowed, as two officers managed to pin him down. Noura attempted to escape through a side hallway, but another group intercepted her. She fought viciously, shouting that the Al-Salim family would not be humiliated and that it was all a travesty. Lucy, pressed against the wall with her heart pounding, saw Khalil and Samira coming in behind the police. Rasheed's mother wore a look mixing fury and heartbreak, while Khalil hurried to make sure Lucy was safe. "Calm down. You're fine now," he murmured, a flash of remorse on his face for the role he had played before repenting. At that moment, Detective Farhad Amin appeared, wearing a somber but victorious expression. He stood before Zaher and Noura, who still struggled against the police. "I have solid evidence that you two conspired to murder Rasheed Al-Salim," Farhad declared, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "It's all on record, plus there are eyewitnesses placing you in the victim's suite the night he died." Consumed by anger, Zaher spewed out curses in a language unfamiliar to some of the bystanders, promising the Al-Salim family would ruin Farhad's career. Noura threw seething glares at Samira, calling her a traitor, and labeled Khalil a fool. Yet the officers followed procedure, handcuffing Zaher and his niece. The entire villa erupted in sirens and flashed red and blue lights across the dusty windows. "You'll regret this, Lucy," Zaher hissed before being led to a police vehicle. "Family doesn't forgive." But Lucy refused to flinch. She had endured so much fear and humiliation that Zaher's threats no longer terrified her the same way. Her legs still trembled, but a surge of relief pulsed through her, compelling her to lift her chin and face him. There was no going back now. Samira, meanwhile, stood by as her brother-in-law and niece were taken away. Her expression merged the sorrow of betrayal with the release of finally seeing the truth come to light. Khalil remained at her side, speechless at the magnitude of what had just happened. The Al-Salim name was forever stained, but at least justice had taken its first step. Lucy leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath, when she felt Detective Farhad's hand on her shoulder. "Well done, Mrs. Morales," he said kindly. We took quite a risk, but it was worth it." She nodded, attempting a smile. A swirl of emotions overwhelmed her. Relief that the police had uncovered the conspiracy and seized those responsible, and sorrow at knowing that, except for Samira and Khalil, the Al-Salim family lay in ruin under the weight of its own ambitions. The cost was enormous, and Rasheed's life could never be reclaimed. While Farhad's men began taping off the villa as a crime scene, Lucy looked at the burnt orange sunset sky and inhaled deeply, struggling to process what had happened. The showdown had ended abruptly. Zaher and Noura were in custody, their pleas of innocence drowned out by the wail of sirens. The truth behind that fatal night was finally emerging, though the damage was done. She felt a bittersweet solace that, even if it couldn't bring Rasheed back, at least it preserved his memory from injustice. Now all that remained was to see whether the legal process would run its course, closing the wound that had festered in the powerful Al-Salim household. In the days that followed Zaher and Noura's arrest, a torrent of news, statements, and legal proceedings kept the Al-Salim family under relentless scrutiny. The scandal rattled public opinion and elite circles alike, since the media now laid bare the entire plot, the bribes, the offshore accounts, and most shockingly, the plan to kill Rasheed. The air of prestige that had cloaked the Al-Salims for decades evaporated under a mountain of damning evidence. From the moment police released the evidence seized at the villa, Zaher and Noura became the chief suspects in the conspiracy that ended Rasheed's life. Formal charges included premeditated murder, conspiracy, and fraud, along with other financial crimes that came to light. The case drew international attention, with every new statement delivering fresh twists. Yet while for many it was just a sensational sideshow, for Lucy and those still loyal within the Al-Salim family, it signaled a period of grief and an agonizing reckoning with the darkest actions of their own kin. Detective Farhad Amin held a press conference to provide a preliminary report on the investigation. He explained how they obtained recordings and testimonies confirming Zaher and Noura's involvement on the night of Rasheed's death. He also highlighted the suspicious transactions both had carried out to divert company funds and lay the groundwork for incriminating Lucy. In his statement, he made it clear that Lucy was entirely uninvolved in the crime. Mrs. Lucy Morales not only had nothing to do with her husband's death, Farhad declared before the cameras, but was instrumental in bringing the truth to light. After reviewing the documents and evidence, the prosecution has determined there is no reason to charge her formally. She is innocent of all accusations. Those official words dramatically changed the course of Lucy's life. In one sense, she felt liberated from the crushing weight she had carried since Rasheed's death. She was no longer under suspicion, nor had to fear that the Al-Salim family or society at large would condemn her. Still, the shadow of tragedy lingered in her heart. The absence of her husband, along with the shattered promise of a shared future, and the memory of those few but intense days together, remained etched in her mind. Yet Samira and Khalil, the two closest members of Rasheed's family, showed a radical shift in their attitude toward Lucy. For the first time, Samira approached her without the usual resentment in her gaze, without the bottled-up anger that had dominated her for so long. Together, they put aside blame and suspicion to talk in a quiet resort hallway, away from both lights and rumors. Visibly shaken, Samira exhaled a long sigh before speaking. "Lucy, She hesitated, looking for the right words. "I want to thank you. You exposed the truth my family was so intent on hiding. Thanks to you, the man who killed my son and his accomplice are facing the consequences of their acts." Lucy swallowed hard, realizing the enormity of Samira's gratitude. She remembered all she had endured under Samira's harsh gaze, how helpless and judged she had felt. Yet she harbored no bitterness. On the contrary, she felt empathy for a grieving mother who had lost her child in such a horrific way. "There's no need to thank me," Lucy whispered, managing a sad, hesitant smile. "Rasheed deserved justice. He trusted me, and I couldn't let him down, even if..." Everything happened so fast." Samira didn't respond at first. She simply placed a hand over Lucy's in a genuine gesture of solidarity. Then she admitted, voice trembling, "I still weep for him. It breaks my heart to recall his smile, his hopes for change. And though I didn't see it before, I know now he truly loved you. He proved it by leaving you those assets and sharing his secrets with you. As a mother, I had to swallow my pride." Lucy sensed the sincerity in those words, and it helped ease the guilt she'd been carrying. After another deep breath, Samira assured her she would do whatever was necessary so that no one would again question Lucy's relationship with Rasheed. Shortly after, Khalil paid Lucy a visit in her room, holding a bouquet of white flowers. His demeanor was somber, eyes filled with remorse. After a moment of hesitation, he spoke candidly. "I worked with Zahir and Noura to box Rasheed out. I was a gullible fool. I was jealous of my older brother, always admired, always successful. I got caught up in their scheme without realizing it would come to this. Please, forgive me if you can." Lucy felt a lump rise in her throat as she pictured Rasheed, kind, always willing to help anyone in need. Yet she couldn't find resentment in her heart for Khalil. His regret appeared genuine. "I forgive you, if you truly mean to change," she answered softly. "Your family's business can do a lot of good if managed differently." Rasheed dreamed of a company that supported the most vulnerable people. Khalil nodded, committing to that vision. He promised to give the authorities all the information needed to strengthen the case against Zahir and Noura, and vowed to work with Samira to rebuild the Al Salim company's leadership, free from the corruption that had tainted it. Meanwhile, the press continued to cover every detail of the legal proceedings. Zahir and Noura appeared before a judge who did not hesitate to impose preventive detention while the investigation deepened. The Al Salim family, now led by Samira and Khalil, released a formal statement condemning Zahir and Noura's actions and offering their support to Lucy. The blow to their reputation was enormous, though no greater than the internal shame of discovering how part of their dynasty had plotted something so sinister against one of their own. The question many asked was what would become of Lucy, now that the case had been resolved. It was confirmed she was heir to the share Rasheed had left her in his will, a percentage of the company's stock and a number of properties, far more than she ever imagined possessing. Yet money had never been her motive. On many restless nights, she reflected on how best to use that inheritance. She recalled her conversations with Rasheed when he would share his dreams of launching charitable initiatives and making a difference in the lives of those in need. Eventually, she reached a firm decision. She announced at a modest press conference that she would use a large portion of the inheritance to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to providing medical and educational services in underprivileged communities. It would be a tribute to Rasheed's generosity and a testament that his memory would not remain buried under scandal. "Rasheed taught me that all this economic power only makes sense if it serves others," she said, voice trembling. "I want to honor his vision. This organization will bear his name so that his memory lives on in every smile we bring to those in need." Her announcement generated a positive reaction in the media and various social sectors. Many began to see Lucy in a new light, as a humble woman who, in the midst of chaos and tragedy, chose a path of solidarity and selflessness. On the day marking 1 month since Rasheed's death, Lucy returned to the place that had sparked both her happiest moments and her most painful memories, the beach where they first walked together. Carrying a bouquet of flowers, she approached the shore at sunset, gazing at the horizon where sky and water met in a soft, multicolored gradient. There, by the water's edge, she quietly summoned his presence. "Rasheed," she murmured into the wind, "I never imagined life would bring us together that way, even if it was so brief. Thank you for loving me, for believing in me, and for trusting me with your secrets. I feel an endless void in your absence, but I promise your legacy will live on." She stood for a few minutes, watching the waves and recalling the last time they walked barefoot, feeling the warm sand underfoot. Her grief still throbbed, but her resolve gave her the strength to move forward. Kneeling, she let the water touch the flowers in her hands and homage to him. Afterward, tears running down her cheeks, she rose slowly. At that moment, she lifted her eyes to the sky. Somehow, she knew Rasheed would be proud of her determination. This wasn't the life she had envisioned upon first arriving at the resort, not even close. But the love they shared and the justice she had fought to reveal kept her hope alive. She thought of her mother, grateful that she was now able to secure proper medical care for her, thanks to her new resources. And she thought of all those who would benefit from the charity she'd established in Rasheed's honor. Lucy stayed there a while longer, letting the ocean breeze dry her tears. She whispered goodbye to the sea and to the memory, knowing the wound would remain forever. Yet she also understood that fate had given her the chance to transform her sorrow into compassion, into love for others. The future stretched out with the promise of hope, and with every wave that broke at her feet, she felt a silent whisper, an echo of the promise she now made to herself and to Rasheed's memory, to carry on and do good in a world that needs it so badly. And that brings our adventure to a close. If you enjoyed the story, feel free to give us a like and subscribe for more moving tales. Take good care of yourself, and remember that any day can mark the start of something amazing. We'll see you in the next video.